I'll start. I'll do roll call and call everybody according to how I see them on the screen. Mr. Cohen,
Present.
Mr. Fishbein,
Present.
Mr. Schultz,
Present.
Mr. England,
Present.
Mr. Pender,
Present.
Charles Williams will be about 10 or 15 minutes late, as will Julie Haywood. Will be running a little bit late, but they will be here. And Pam Henry is present. And can I have a motion to approve the meetings from the last meeting, the September Ed Affairs meeting?
So moved.
Just a second. Don't.
Second.
I was gonna say, don't everybody jump at one time. Usually we're like stumbling over each other. The minutes are approved. And now, Dr. Hacker, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Henry, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. The way we are actually working through this evening's Ed Affairs Committee meeting is a little bit different than normal. First of all, I'm not normally the presenter for this information, but Dr. Smith and I had some conversations around the sharing of data, and she was kind enough to allow me to share some of the information that I've been doing a deep dive into over the past few weeks. And she is going to take over during the November meeting in order to present the data that will be looked at for the benchmark assessments, which are in the process of being completed actually as we speak. And both the benchmark assessments that are being administered in all grades, as well as these PSSA and Keystone results, together really can give our staff members and our administrators insight into student performance. And while we know that last year was a bit of an anomaly in terms of, how well students were able to progress through the curriculum, given that the majority of the year was virtual, we nonetheless want to take a look at that in comparison to past years, so that we can kind of gauge what we need to be working on for the current school year. So again, I just want to thank Dr. Smith for allowing me to kind of take control over this evening's meeting. I assured her I turned things back over to her for the November meeting, so I can have my swan song, so to speak, this evening. I also want to thank many of our principals who are here this evening. I asked them if they could participate this evening in order to offer some commentary in terms of the school improvement programs and plans that they have in place, the interventions that they are using this year with students in order for all of us to kind of ensure that our students will be making progress since we are all in person. I also want to thank Roshana Floyd, who is our math specialist at Glenside, and Roshana graciously agreed to be here this evening because unfortunately Michelle Robinson has an ill family member, and so Mrs. Floyd was so nice to be able to agree to be here and help with sharing information about Glenside and the interventions that they're putting into place. Mr. Lytle is not here this evening. He unfortunately was sick this afternoon and went home early from school. So I'll share a little bit of the Myers data. And on that note, I want to thank Dr. Riley, because originally I was unable to access the Myers data since the Myers students did not take the PSSAs last year. And the Navigator reports that I looked at in Linkit, which is our data warehousing system, did not contain any information for Myers. And so Dr. Riley came to the rescue and was kind enough to take a dive into some of the other data as it is stored in Linkit, and was able to get the Myers data for me. But unfortunately, you won't see a slide in the presentation, but I will reference the Myers data as well. And finally, I just want to note that while, again, you won't see it here in this evening's presentation, one of the beauty parts about Linkit, the tool that we use in order to warehouse all of our data systems, including the benchmark assessments, as well as our curriculum-based assessments, is it gives you the ability to drill down literally by standard in whatever content area is being tested, so that teachers have a remarkable instrument for actually figuring out not only how are students doing in math overall, but in terms of every single standard in math. So that means that they can take that information, and if they need to, they can cluster or group students who are having, for example, similar weaknesses or difficulties around understanding certain concepts, skills, or standards, and they can provide them with the interventions needed for those specific types of skills. So it's very, very useful to all of us. The other thing that I'd like to mention before we get into the data is that we see certain trends in our own data that we have seen across the state. And this is a multi-year review. So we're beginning way back in 2015 and 16 and looking at more or less what are our results over time. And I can tell you that from the state level, we see the same types of trends. And the first trend is that English language arts consistently is better in terms of the results that we see than mathematics. Mathematics is a significantly lower, the scores are significantly lower across the state in nearly every single school district. What we will see tonight is not unusual. Secondly, in terms of science, students tend to do very well in grade 4. Then the science scores begin to slip a bit as the grade levels go up. It's tested only in 4th grade and 8th grade. So by 8th grade, students typically do not do as well as they did in grades 4. We are seeing the same thing in our results here in Cheltenham. And then everyone seems to struggle with biology across the entire state. And of course, you'll see that in our biology Keystone results this evening as well. We have low numbers in terms of the number of students who took the PSSAs. So you will see that our population size this past year in 2020, 2021 is vastly different than it was in the years preceding that. And finally, unfortunately, we do see when we disaggregate the data, and you'll see those results here this evening in terms of race and ethnicity, that we see similar trends to what unfortunately we've come to anticipate. And that is that traditionally white students perform better than all other races and ethnic groups. And that is true in our data as well. And of course, we also have a way to go with special education and trying to meet the needs of our special ed students. So that being said, let me get started, and I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what we are seeing in English language arts in grade 3 and math in grade 3. And remember what I said, I didn't have the Myers data at the time, so that's why Myers is not listed. But what I can share with you that the Myers data in English language arts from the year 2015-16 and going across to 2018-19, the last year we have, is about 61%, 78%, 64%, and then 59% in English language arts. The number 95 that you see here next to Cheltenham scores in 2018-19, and then the 90 for Glenside and the 80 for Wyncote is an average. That's an average number of students who took the PSSA. And then of course, in the last column, you see that was significantly decreased last year when we had a number of students who were virtual and a number of students who opted out from taking the PSSA. Again, in grade 3, as I said before, you see a significant difference between the English language arts scores, which hover around the 70 percentile. And when you get into the math in grade 3, you're seeing numbers more closely aligned to the 50s and 60s in terms of percentages of how students are doing. And this just shows that math proficiency with a graph. I took out the English language arts grade 3 slide only because unfortunately there was an error there that I did not catch. And so I did take that slide out, but you did see the data on the previous slide. And it just shows you how the 3 schools compare. And sometimes it's just more easy to visualize that when you see it in the shape of an actual graph, but these numbers are the same as what you saw on the previous slide. And then in grade 4, remember we have science, so we have clustered English language arts scores for grade 4, math scores for grade 4, and science scores for grade 4. And again, I do have some Myers data, and I'll just say for English language arts, Myers averages over a 4-year span of time, approximately 70% in terms of the English language arts percentile. And in math, they're somewhere around about 47% in terms of math. Again, not too significantly different, but slightly lower than what we have for the other 3 schools. So if you take a moment to look at the slide, you'll see, as I mentioned before, we do quite well in science, comparatively speaking. Numbers in the percents are mostly in the 80s. Think about that when we get to grade 8 and we look at science again, because again, you'll see the similar trend that we see across the state. The scores will begin dropping as we go higher up in the grades. So I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to stop here with grades 3 and 4 and keep this particular slide up. And I think we'll start maybe with our guest this evening, Mrs. Floyd, our math specialist at Glenside. And Mrs. Floyd, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask if you would just share a little bit of information about some of the work that's going on at Glenside in order to help work with our students and provide them with supports to do better.
Wonderful. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me tonight. Would you like me to speak, Dr. Hacker, on behalf of both reading and math? Is that correct?
If you're able to, that would be wonderful.
Sure, okay. The wonderful thing about Glenside is that we are focusing on strengths-based. We're not worried about what happened in the past with the pandemic. What we're doing is we're looking to move our children and scholars forward. As far as reading is concerned, we began our small group intervention instruction earlier than normal, which is wonderful. We wanted to catch the children when the school year first began. We are focusing especially on our tier 2 and tier 4 scholars. We want to make sure they are getting double dose of guided reading every day. We know that guided reading is so important. We want to make sure that our children are meeting their proficiency level. Thankfully, foundations, we are well on our way with foundations. K1 and 2, we're focusing on foundations, using that instruction every day. And of course, we're marrying that with our Wonders curriculum as well. As far as the new teachers are concerned and teachers that are in new positions, we wanted to focus on giving the teachers early PD and focusing on comprehension. This is a school-wide goal for the last few years. We've been working on foundations and really getting our phonemic awareness down and word formation and such. And we feel as if now is the time to move to our comprehension. We also are making sure that we are working together as a team so that when teachers are informed, we'll be able to perfect our instruction. So we are creating a curriculum and instruction committee because what we want to do is we want to look cross levels. We want to see, okay, what did our scholars learn in second grade? Here is where they are. Here is where we want to take them. The second and third grade teachers will have a conversation. And the third and fourth grade teachers will have a conversation so that we can all have one main goal. As far as math is concerned, Mrs. Robinson sent 2 teachers to the University of Pennsylvania this summer in order to build their craft as far as math routines. We are implementing a new math routine system using quick images, which is when an image is shown to students and then you quickly take it away and the students will have a conversation. How many numbers did you see? We've been working on the word subitizing. Subitizing is when you look at a number without counting and you know exactly what that number is. We're having conversations and having discourse, and we know that computation builds with our problem solving. And of course, we want to make sure our teachers are being trained, so we are giving turnaround training to our teachers. We already had one session, and we're going to build upon it. Our goal is to marry our new learning with the envision. And of course, we always want to keep cultural proficiency at the helm of everything we do. The cadre is now working on Goldie Muhammad's Cultivating Genius, which is an equity framework for culturally and historically responsive literacy. And we know that reading and writing go hand in hand. So we are using those tenets, and we're going to be giving turnaround training to teachers as well.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Floyd, for giving that wonderful snapshot of the terrific things going on in your building. And I appreciate, again, your being here to share all of that with us. I'm next going to turn to Mrs. Clark, Dr. Clark, pardon me, to give us an idea of what's happening at Wyncote.
Good evening, everybody. So at Wyncote Elementary, I would say this year, we've been extremely intentional in looking at student data and trying to recognize the needs of the whole child. So as we look at our 5-year average in ELA, that comes to about 70% proficiency, as well as math. Our 5-year average is 58.2. And so in looking at the supports that we want to provide students, there are a number of things. So we have partnered with Arcadia University and a program, a STEAM program that meets after school. Currently this year, the program is still virtual, but we do have a number of students in 1st through 4th grade who are part of that program. It really gives them some experience with higher order thinking, some hands-on learning, and really using some inquiry-based practices in order to support not only our science, but our math and our reading as well. The Office of Education has adjusted the daily schedule of our challenge consultants. And so now our challenge teachers are teaching a makerspace lab. And in that makerspace lab, this allows our teachers to rotate through every grade, and they are not only providing support in reading, math, and science enrichment, but they're also incorporating creativity, critical thinking, communications, and collaboration. So I'm just trying to think of ways that we can not just work harder, but smarter. And so we are looking at a multitude of initiatives that are infusing all of the curriculum areas and trying to get our students thinking. We also have skill builders, which is something we've done at Wyncote for a number of years. We've met after school for a number of years. This year, we are changing it a bit, and we'll be doing skill builders before school. We considered doing it as a virtual option, but it didn't seem as though we were getting the interest with an online option. And so skill builders will again meet this year. It'll be before school. This is a group that skill builders targets our 3rd grade and 4th grade students who are high basic and low proficient. We've chosen this particular group of students specifically because we find that it's this group of students that we find the most movement in when we're trying to look at moving our proficient rates higher. And so not that we're not focusing on other groups and other subgroups and students who are either scoring below or above, but this particular group of students, maybe they don't get the same kind of additional supports during the day. And so we're providing them with some additional intervention and just incorporating additional strategies for them as we try to move their scores higher. We also announce our weekly math facts winners. We make it, and so that's something we're doing for math, trying to make it a part of our school culture to applaud student success. We know that math has been an area in our school that we have continually focused on as it relates to looking at improvements and needs as far as growing. And so we announce those students actually look forward to seeing and hearing about their classmates and students from various grades who have done well as it relates to extra math or any type of little initiative or incentive as it relates to our math programs. And lastly, I would say that we are, I asked my teachers as we started the school year, it's not a marathon starting out. And as much as we want to get right into it, I really wanted to focus on the whole child. Our students had, it's been a while since all of them have been in the same space. So we intentionally set aside some time in our schedule every day. We call it our SEL period. And so that's our period in the morning for social emotional learning. That's when my morning announcements are sent out to all teachers, and everyone is involved in a level of team building, of checking the temperature of students in the class, as well as our PBIS initiatives. And so I think we've had a great start. And those are just some of the things that we're doing this year to set WinCode off in a good direction.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark, and particularly for sharing what you did about the efforts in critical problem solving, creative thinking. And I know that I've been there with you during those morning announcements and that community building time. And I think it's really valuable to be spending that time with the students to give them a chance to get acclimated back in together as a classroom community. So thank you for doing that. So next I'm going to turn to Mr. Perez.
Good evening, everyone. I want to try not to be redundant because I heard a lot of similar things that are going on at some of the other schools. So I'm going to just highlight some things that we're doing that are slightly different. But in the area of literacy, where we're going to continue to support our core instruction, utilizing the district core program, but with a strong emphasis that we have had in the previous years on small group differentiated instruction. We're going to be obviously looking at our data, progress monitoring our students, ensuring that our guided reading instruction is consistent throughout, monitoring students' growth and providing that small group intervention and enrichment for students. I think that's important. And we're obviously going to be targeting students that might need additional support, and obviously targeting students that might need any before or after school tutoring when that becomes available. We noticed that within our third grade, being with the pandemic, and we've had great success over when those particular students were in kindergarten, first grade, with our foundations program, and we want to make sure that with second grade, they didn't have that in-person kind of instruction that they had in kindergarten and first grade. So we're really targeting some of those students who have some phonics concerns in third grade. So we're really going to focus heavily on that. And then obviously we're going to work to provide some professional development that we see for teachers where there may be some gaps and inconsistency throughout. In the area of math, which is our top goal that you keep hearing throughout, we will focus heavily on small group instruction for mathematics as well. Identifying students by level and providing the support and enrichment that they need. We got a ton of materials now that we are in person from the new updated Envision series that came throughout the summer. Thank you to the Office of Education. So we're utilizing those materials and really working towards how teachers can integrate all of those materials, because there's such a ton of resources, but also being consistent in the way that we approach the instruction with our students. in addition to supporting teachers that might need some additional professional development. Another fun thing, within fourth grade, we are ensuring that students know their facts, things of that nature, to really have some automaticity. At the end of the week, I'm going to see if I'm smarter than a fourth grader. They're challenging me to minute math, and a group of students who have earned the right to try to beat the principal are going to get an opportunity to do so at the end of this week. So hopefully that becomes something that kids will look forward to, and they will challenge me as well as I'm being challenged as well. And obviously we're supporting students. I think we all realize that students' social and emotional needs are important in order for them to really progress. So we want to continue to support those students throughout the beginning of the school year and throughout whatever they need social emotionally. So we're continuing to provide a safe, supportive environment, ensuring that students know that they're loved, that they're cared for, that they're safe, and then we can build on that to progress them academically.
Thank you so much, Mr. Perez. And you might call it redundancy, but I call it consistency. And it's nice to know that there is some consistency of practices across all of our elementary school programming, but also that there are some unique features, and that each principal or the school leaders in our schools recognize that their own school community is unique to them and may have specific needs. So thank you to the three of you for highlighting what those needs might be and how you're approaching handling skill development as well as conceptual thinking in your schools. Much appreciated that you could do this for us this evening. So we're going to turn to grades 5 and 6 and Elkins Park. And here we have both ELA and math proficiency scores. And again, you see a similar trend with English language arts and with math over time, as well as compared to one another. And so shortly, we're going to hear from Mr. Wallace about his grade 5 proficiency. And then looking at grade 6, we see, again, another similar pattern in terms of the English language arts performance and the math performance. So Mr. Wallace, I'm going to turn it back to you if you wouldn't mind sharing some information about some of the things you're putting into place at Elkins Park in order to assist our scholars there.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. The first thing is we'll start with our biggest challenge, which is mathematics. However, we're up to the challenge. In 5th grade and 6th grade, we'll talk about some of the strategies we plan on using. One is we review student work weekly, and student work that is based on similar type of problem solving or problems that they'll see on the PSSA, to see if the students are making progress in the actual type of problems that they might see on an everyday basis. We also realize that even in the mathematics for 5th and 6th grade, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that the biggest struggle that 5th and 6th graders are having is answering those open-ended responses. So just as we did 2 years ago before the pandemic started with great results, we're putting all of our focus on making sure that students practice and are familiar with those open-ended questions that usually happen at the end of a math question that we knew as when we were coming up as word problems. A lot of our students got maybe 1 or 0s or didn't really attempt those problems. So we prepare them, get them used to seeing them. We believe that that will yield outstanding results. And also we will provide intervention and help with our students who are struggling in mathematics. As we switch to ELA, I'm actually, even though it was, another thing about mathematics is we looked at a very low number of students that took that test. And if you look, it was less than almost 100 students in all of EP that took the math test. So one of the things that we're gonna do moving forward is try to encourage as many people to take the test so that that would also help us as well. In ELA, even though it was the pandemic year, there's a little bit to be proud of because we were very proud of our 6th grade results of 72%. Which was well above the state average, even though it was a pandemic year, but we still have some work to do. In 5th grade, we had 58%. But one of the things that we'll do is almost the same as mathematics. at the end of a long passage, our students are answering most of their multiple choice sections of the PSSA correctly. What they're struggling with is answering what we call the text-dependent analysis or open-ended questions. So again, weekly, monthly, we'll give them the opportunity to experience those real-world problems, the same type of problems that they'll see on the test, the same type of word problems and essays that they'll actually see through their academics, careers, and trades, probably for the rest of their life. So they can read questions, write well, improve on their writing, and answer open-ended responses. And we'll be monitoring that weekly as we go along. Some other things that we put in place for the whole school is making sure, again, that we use our what I need period, known as the when period, to make sure that we're giving students the resources and interventions that they need to help improve their overall performance. We're also monitoring what everyone's doing instructionally during that period, and also monitoring the progress of our students as they're experiencing their intervention. So just looking very close at the data, looking at student work, looking at the assessments to make sure that we are making some progress. We also added tutoring, especially in the area of math, that will take place some during school and mostly in the morning, and offer those to our students who may need some extra help. What we are noticing is that our students did come in a little bit with some challenges in the beginning of the year, but what we are noticing is that they are making up the progress pretty fast, and they are closing the gap, and we're excited about that. The students seem to be excited back, and as I walk around the classroom, the teachers are doing a fabulous job getting those students caught up. The other thing that we revised and we looked at our wonderful big brothers over there at Cedarbrook, as they have a fantastic MTSS program, and we just took most of it, and they have a wonderful Google form. So now we're able to identify students that may be struggling, follow up with them, give teachers resources to work with them, and give them the help that they need before they need some drastic help, so that we can meet students where they are and increase their performance as soon as possible. And then the last thing that we're focusing on, seems a little weird, but in these times, I think is important and really will help their overall academic performance, is we actually, believe it or not, are focusing on how happy our students are. And are they having a fun year? Now, this sounds weird, but studies have shown students who enjoy school, who are having a good time, tend to do better and continue to love school and become lifelong learners. And that's important to us for the 5th and 6th grade, so that we can pass our wonderful students on to the high school and to Cedarbrook ready and excited about learning. So those are some things that we're doing to make sure that we increase the overall academic performance of Elkins Park School.
Thanks so much, Mr. Wallace. And I just want to mention that I appreciate what you actually started off talking about, which is responding to open-ended questions and really focusing in on the need to assist students with learning how to do that, because one of the key conceptual ideas behind open-ended questions is helping students identify the fact that there may be various strategies for attacking problems in mathematics, and that no one strategy is necessarily the best way for all types of problems. And when you have students trained in how to approach open-ended questions, they learn that. They learn strategizing and trying to figure out solutions by using different approaches, which is a very important skill in mathematics. So thank you for focusing on that with your students. So with that, we're going to turn to, excuse me, we're going to turn to grades 7 and 8 with Mr. Metcalf to talk about English language arts and math scores in grade 7, and then the addition of science in grade 8. So Mr. Metcalf, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Hacker. So overall, I would say one of the largest changes we've made has been with block scheduling. Block scheduling has had a huge impact on our entire school, right? It's allowed for more instructional minutes in English and math class, which has been really, really great, right? But what good is that if we don't know what to do at that time? So one of the other benefits that we've had has been the professional development that we've been receiving. So right now we are currently working with Corwin, as well as the ASCD. And so that professional development from Corwin has been around PLCs, right? It's been around examining student data, designing interventions collectively to support academics. We're also working on, how to perform with small group instruction within the classroom, reteaching opportunities, student engagement, and then student discourse strategies to increase higher order thinking within our classroom. So not only is Corwin doing that, but we also are going to be utilizing components of the Danielson framework to, focus in on every month and add a new component within, the instructional piece, which is domain 3. For ASCD, the professional development we've been receiving from them has been around lesson planning and instructional design. And basically, I guess the premise for that would be, how do you structure learning in the classroom? So again, how do we utilize that extra time in the classroom in order for us to support our scholars? We know that small group instruction, as I mentioned earlier, is a very, very large and important factor with trying to improve our academic outcomes, because you're allowed to then pull scholars that may be struggling and reteach in various ways to try to help those scholars have an opportunity to learn. At the same time, you're able to meet with some other groups of scholars that may be above the level of what you're teaching, and then you can push them so they can have extension within the classroom. In addition to that, as I said, our instructional focus of the month, just to talk a little bit more about that, we've had PD on key components. And again, what we currently are focusing on has been around 3A and 3B. 3A being communicating with students. We've been really focusing on our learning objectives and making sure that they're meaningful and measurable. And then 3B being question and discussion techniques. And again, as I said earlier, really focusing on like those student discourse strategies, right? So what does it look like, for us to be distinguished? What does it look like for us to be proficient, within the classroom based on the Danielson framework? In addition to that, while we've had WIN class before, we've changed the format of WIN class. So WIN classes are on a 6-day rotating cycle. Within those 6 days, we have 2 English classes, 2 math classes, 1 science class, and 1 social emotional learning intervention within our 6-day cycle. Support is identified based on previous standardized data, benchmarks, as well as research-based interventions. What we currently are using are IXL and Read 180. The teachers, they meet once a week in PLCs. So we just completed benchmarks for English, math, and science. And, currently we're starting to do our data review and dig into those scores to identify, what areas our scholars are not performing on. Prior to that, we had all of our scholars take the IXL diagnostic test for English and math. And with that, the diagnostic then creates a program for scholars to use to support them around skills of weak performance. So we're really starting to get into our interventions now, where we can support our scholars. With regards to MTSS, as Principal Wallace mentioned, I have to say, I did not create this. I came into it and it's amazing. We've had, a couple meetings already, and really, how do we identify scholars who are struggling now so we can prevent them from having learning needs later on, right? And so we go through on a monthly basis, scholars who are struggling academically, scholars who are struggling behaviorally, and we try to provide them with supports so they don't, fall into some of our scholars that may eventually be tier 3, tier 4 scholars. So these scholars are targeted, as well to identify key programs here at Cedar Brook that we have. In addition to that, we do have an academic tutoring program that we are going to be involved with. And so we also look at our MTSS program to identify scholars for that program. In addition to that, we're identifying scholars from other intervention programs we have as well, such as IXL and Read 180. And then obviously from benchmark data and previous standardized data, we're going to utilize that as well, so we can make sure that we're targeting the correct amount of students that need support with tutoring so they can improve academically and also improve with their skills. We can't forget about PBIS. I think Dr. Clark mentioned PBIS at her school, and we know that, while, learning is at the center of everything we're doing, if our culture of the school, if our climate and culture of the school is not intact, we're not going to be able to teach. And so PBIS has been going really well. We had a kickoff activity. We had a lot of scholars that were involved. We had a lot of fun that day. And so how do we continue to make school fun, which I think is important, and at the same time, push our academics and continue to push our scholars to grow? So those are some of the things we've been doing. Last thing I would say would just be with CIPD, in which, we're looking at professional development throughout the district. And so some of the focus that we have there is on grading and our grading policies, and to ensure that they're aligned with the school data that we have. Lastly, I'll say again, common assessments. We have to continue to work on common assessments. How do I know my A in my class is the same A in your class? Especially if we're teaching the same thing, then it's appropriate for our scholars to be tested on the same material, same questions. And then as collectively as a group of teachers, we can kind of focus on, hey, what did you do differently that I didn't do? So we can, again, improve, work on improving our instruction. From an ELA perspective, I just want to say, just to address that specifically, interventions and supports that we have done to support our scholars around literacy have been our Penny Kittles professional development. So really focusing on reading and writing, right? So we have a new books in our libraries, in our classrooms. We have high multi-text interests. So I'm talking about race, gender identity, interests, culture. We focus on getting scholars to read because we know reading engagement and development, it helps to support scholars with their reading stamina. And then the reason why we really focused on different genres and different types of books is because we want to have that interest. We want scholars to have a vast variety of things that they're reading. We want them to develop and expand their vocabulary. We want them to gain a deeper interest of the text. We want them to also increase their reading comprehension and also improve writing skills. We also have worked with Dr. Fishman with our writing curriculum, and that's been around the utilization of the writing curriculum with fidelity. So I think that's the important part. Are we going in to make sure that we're seeing the actual writing happening in the classroom? And meeting with our PLCs, we're able to actually target some of the things we want to see more by speaking with our teachers. Also, are we having scholars respond to writing in various ways? And then are we focusing on text-dependent analysis? So all those things are things we're able to address through our PLCs and support our teachers with. In addition to that, every morning I have morning announcements. And so with my morning announcements, trying to create a culture within our building, I do root words of the day as well as math terms of the day, to kind of help our scholars just hear that information more. And we're trying to build a culture around literacy. Obviously, we believe literacy is the heartbeat of our school, but as a former math teacher, we also understand that math, we're not performing well and we need to improve our scores greatly. With regards to math, some of the areas that we are supporting, and helping to improve our scores has also, again, around our interventions, as we discussed earlier, but also the use of a research-based intervention, which is IXL, again, to target skill deficits and provide support during class, as well as during our WIN periods. Developing and creating more practice around open-ended responses. I think a number of number of principals have already talked about that. But we do feel that, scholars need to practice, so how do you break down a word problem? How do you pull out the key information? What are the procedures that you should possibly use in order to, be able to answer the question? Are you answering the math question? So teaching scholars that, right? Not just putting a problem in front of them and just having them do it. We have to teach them, how to answer those questions appropriately. And then around 8th grade science, with that, again, we're utilizing MTSS and PLCs effectively to first identify scholars of color that may be on a bubble. And this is overall with all of our scholars. And then we're also trying to find ways to group our scholars accordingly so we can best support them.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Metcalf. Sometimes I forget that you're just new to the middle school this year based on all of that tremendously valuable information that you shared about what's going on. And again, I just want to remind everyone, as Mr. Metcalf explained, that it is a new schedule in the middle school this year. So part of implementing a new block of time, which is nearly double what the last periods of instructional time used to be, is in helping teachers to understand how to maximize the use of that time and not waste it. It doesn't mean start your homework 20 minutes before the end of the period. It means really finding different transitions within an 82-minute block of time. It means changing and implementing a variety of different activities, whether it's small group, think, pair, share, independent work, teacher-led instruction, working on IXL, as Mr. Metcalf mentioned. So there are a number of ways to utilize that extensive block of time. That plus, of course, as he mentioned, the PLCs, which really give teachers an opportunity to come together and collaborate. And we know that collaboration amongst teachers is often rare in schools, and yet they need it so much. They need to be able to come together and talk about, for example, as we're looking at these math scores, what is it that you're seeing in your class? I'm having difficulty teaching this particular concept. What can you recommend as a strategy? How can together we work to develop, as he mentioned, common assessments so that the expectations for learning are the same for all scholars and don't vary necessarily from one class to the next. So thank you, Mr. Metcalf, for providing all of that wonderful information about so much that is going on in your school as well. So I want to take a little detour and go back to elementary school scores in the next slides up through 8th grade before we turn to the Keystone exams, which take place in Algebra 1 in middle school, as well as in the high school for both Algebra 1, biology, and literature. And I want to take a look at disaggregated data by race. So this just gives a little bit of an overview. This looks like a very jam-packed slide, but if you look at the top half of the slide, this is English language arts in grade 3. Again, disaggregated by our racial and ethnic groups in the district. And the bottom portion of the slide, the bottom half, is our math scores. And again, shows disaggregated data. So it's very clear to see when you look at the data, two trends that we've noted before. And one is that in general, English language arts seems to be producing higher achievement than what we typically see in math. But again, we are seeing that some groups are outperforming other groups. And so this gives us direction and tells us that we need to focus on students who do not perform as well traditionally as other groups. And I heard each of the principals mention in their explanations this evening what they are trying to do to not only attack students who are on the bubble between performing at the basic level and the proficient level, but also in terms of looking at students as individuals and what do they need in order to be able to perform better. And so obviously this points to that and the need to be able to do that. For the next grade, grade 4, you see similar types of trends. Again, ELA on the top, math on the bottom. And in grade 4, again, a similar trend in terms of looking at our racial and ethnic groups. Again, math scores, as you can see on the bottom half of the slide, tend to be lower overall, but again, similar trends with our white students and our Asian students outperforming our other groups. And remember, multiple means more than one race or ethnicity. A student may identify as having multiple races or being a part of multiple ethnic groups. In our next slide, it's a little bit differently. The first half from going from the left over to the right shows English language arts. And then in the middle, you'll see Math Asian, and going over to the right again, you'll see the rest of the racial groups in grade 5 for math proficiency. And this shows, I think, rather starkly the disparities that you see between English language arts performance versus math performance. And again, you see fairly starkly the differences in terms of racial and ethnic groups, with Asian students performing highest, followed by our white students, and then our Black, Hispanic, and multiple. In our grade 6, again, starting at the left, these are English language arts scores. And then as you move towards the center of the slide, you'll see Math Asian, which begins the math scores, continuing over towards the right. And then I flipped them actually here, not intentionally, but it was unfortunately how I was able to do the slide. In grade 7, math actually is on the top with English language arts on the bottom. And I know that Mr. Metcalf knows this, but there's a lot of work to be done, obviously, in 7th and 8th grade math. We know that conceptually, the math concepts and skills become increasingly difficult. Students are doing a lot more pre-algebraic thinking in those grade levels if they're not in algebra at this point. And so the math itself becomes more challenging and more difficult. But again, we continue to see these disparities across our racial and ethnic groups. And the same, of course, is true in grade 8. So I just want to take an opportunity at this point to stop there and to ask if any of the principals wanted to offer any commentary about the racial data that we have for the PSSA results.
No disparity, but just a report on this is something that our schools taking seriously, and we look at year in year. One area of success, even though again it was in the pandemic year, was how 6th grade performed in their ELA scores. So we were able to close that gap a little bit last year. So we hopefully will continue to work on that as we go forward.
Just trying to pull that back up for you.
Yeah, so for 6th grade, for example, it was 72% for ELA for 6th grade, which we were really excited about, even though, again, not a lot of people took that test compared to the normal size of Elkins Park. But one of the things that we were proud of, and then obviously we have a long way to go, is that 60% of the African-American students who took that test that we sent on to Mr. Metcalf scored 60%. And so even though that's not where we want to be, it's still above the state average and something that we could be proud of and something we have to keep going on moving forward.
Brian, were you referencing this slide, the one that was disaggregated by race?
Absolutely, for 6th
Okay.
grade, yes.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else among the principals who just wanted to share anything?
Yeah, I would just say we're really looking at, through our MTSS, really looking at, targeting our students of color, that are on the bubble first, and initially. And I don't mean first like we're not going to work with the rest of our scholars that are struggling, but we want to try to provide them with support right away because they would be the easiest group of scholars to move. And after that, how do we intensify and add more levels of complexity for other scholars, that are struggling, especially our students of color that are underperforming their peers. And I think, I'm glad that we have our WIN class, set up in the way we do. And I'm just going to say, as a math teacher, I'm going to be pulling kids myself to make sure we can move these scores. So I've already, no bragging on against any of the principals, but I've been teaching a couple lessons here and there just to, one, to lead by example, to let teachers know that I'm not going to be afraid to ask them to do what I'm going to be doing in the classroom, or sorry, what I want them to do in the classroom. But we've got to make sure that we are targeting our scholars, and we have to make sure our teachers are intentional about looking for those areas of weakness, whether it be in the classroom, or during some of those intervention tests that we're giving our scholars. And then how do teachers, during the PLCs talk about moving those scholars? How do we, and again, it goes back to how do we, reteach in the classroom? How are we, pulling small groups? How are we utilizing question and discussion techniques? All those things are extremely key. And as you said, Dr. Hacker, whether it's turn and talks, how are we creating student discourse and raising higher order thinking in the classroom are going to be kind of key to not just moving our Black and brown children, but also all of our scholars. And so we have to continue to have that intentional focus. And that's what we're planning on doing.
And thank you for mentioning intentionality because, part of our work, and I know there was, it was referenced earlier this evening about our work in terms of cultural proficiency and implicit bias and so forth. And they do go hand in hand with what we're talking about here when it comes to student achievement. So, you know, implicit bias, if it exists, can play itself out in terms of who does the teacher call on when hands are raised or when hands are not raised, who is acknowledged, who's given affirmation when they respond to something. And so having this level of consciousness around the way we teach and how we engage students in the classroom is also really critical to fostering not only independent thinking and learning, but also greater academic achievement. Because when students feel recognized and appreciated and valued in the classroom, and that's not just social and emotional in terms of talking about feelings, but it's also about intentionality on the part of the teacher. And the teacher being willing to say, I'm going to make it my business today to make sure that every single child is recognized today and has an opportunity to participate and has an opportunity to contribute. And I'm going to affirm the value of that contribution in order to help my students feel valued when they come to my class every day. So I know a couple of the principals had mentioned that, and I just wanted to really repeat the fact that that is so critically important to students really getting the benefit of being in the classroom every single day. And so that's why this intensive work that we are doing in the area of cultural proficiency, I know Mrs. Floyd talked about the cadres, is so critically important. And the work that they are doing in those cadres and sharing with teachers is so valuable in terms of continuing to build upon what we've already started in the district. So let me move forward to primarily Dr. Lahara, because Keystones are given, these are end of course assessments. So when a student completes a course in algebra, they take an algebra Keystone. And I'm actually also going to ask Mr. Metcalf to talk about Algebra 1, and then we're going to kind of try to explain why Algebra 1 looks very different in the middle school in terms of performance versus Algebra 1 at the high school. There are reasons for that. Students can take the literature Keystone. There's no one literature course. They take courses in English and can take the Keystone after any of those courses. The biology is an end of course exam. So when a student takes biology, they take the biology Keystone. And if you remember, I'll reference back to what we talked about at the very beginning about our science scores. And again, if you noticed, the fourth grades were hovering in the 80 percentile. And then we got down to 8th grade and we were dropping into the 50 and 60 percentile. And of course, now when you look at biology, the end of course that is specifically related to biology content, you can see what these scores look like. So I'm going to start with Mr. Metcalf again to talk about the Algebra 1 Keystone results and why they are so much better than PSSA scores.
So first thing I would say, you know, looking at the data, and I had the numbers, I forget how many scholars actually took the Algebra 1 Keystones last year. You know, but one of the things I'll say is we have done a good job ensuring that our scholars who are meeting the qualifications to be in our Algebra 1 course or our geometry course as 8th graders, targeting them and providing them with the opportunity to take an advanced math course. I would say this year, this transitional year has been kind of rough, right? Some of our scholars did not receive, you know, a full, you know, year, you know, face-to-face of academic instruction. And so trying to, you know, and hats off to Dr. Riley and Dr. Smith and their team, hats off, and Ms. Collins, hats off to them, and working together to create, you know, an opportunity for us to identify scholars. It wasn't just based on a test, you know, and I would have to say that, you know, we looked at a number of different data points throughout the, you know, the course of a scholar's math career to identify which scholars, would be successful. 'Cause that's the goal, right? We want to make sure they're successful, and at the same time, make sure they're not skipping over standards that we know will affect them. This is me putting my math hat on and my high school teacher hat on, that will affect them and impact them, much greater later on down the line when they get to Algebra 2, pre-calculus, calculus, right? So how do we ensure these scholars have those skills that they're going to skip over, because this will be a 1-year advancement. For some, it may be a 2-year advancement if they're taking it in 7th grade. And then how do we ensure that they'll be successful? And really, that's been a really tedious, job, fighting with parents at different times, because, they really want their scholar to be in an advanced math course, but also I think some of the changes that have happened at the high school with block scheduling as well have benefited us, right? Because, initially it was like, hey, we got to make sure our scholars can get to calculus BC, right? Calc AB, Calc BC. Well, block scheduling at the high schools allowed scholars now to come through our traditional programming, in 8th grade, take pre-algebra, go to the high school, take algebra, and still be able to get to Calc AB and BC prior to them leaving 11th grade, right? And so that's been a great support, and us trying to help parents understand, just because your scholar's smart, like, give them time, right? Let's let them grow. We don't have to rush the process. Needless to say, we have parents that still want their child to be in that program. And so, going through that process with our parents has been a fun experience. And hearing out, parents' concerns with it, and what we can do to support them. I will say, as we talk about, students of color in our Algebra 1 class, Black females are our largest demographic. The last time I checked, for scholars that were actually taking Algebra 1 right now at Cedarbrook. So we have been working to identify students of color that, and we'll say intentionally, looking to identify students of color that should be in Algebra 1, in order to ensure that we are, not allowing our hidden bias and implicit bias, to affect us in that way, where we're not traditionally seeing students of color in our advanced math classes.
And Craig, I flipped to the second slide just to show the performance level in middle school Algebra 1 as compared, where you have your Black scholars at the middle school in Algebra 1 compared to your white scholars. And fortunately, that gap has narrowed as compared to the other math courses that students are in. So that's a good sign that obviously that's occurring. So I'm going to go back to the other one. And Rennie, would you like to talk about high school algebra, since we're on the topic of algebra? Dr. Lahara?
Sure. So obviously when we get to Algebra 1 at the high school, there are more students that take that course. So obviously there's a lot more work to be done. And a lot of students, due to them not taking that pre-algebra in middle school, when they come to the high school, it's a larger lift, heavier lift for us at the high school with our math teachers to make sure that our students are prepared to be successful in Algebra 1 Keystone when they take it. So as Mr. Metcalf stated earlier, we are doing the same exact thing that Cedarbrook is doing in terms of the block scheduling, helping us now with math teachers actually doing small group instruction and as we call it in the elementary level, guided math, to make sure that our students are really grasping the concepts that they need to be successful. Our PLCs are actually starting to be in place as well. And we also have something that's unique to the high school now, which is an intervention period, which is a 40-minute period every day where scholars can ask their teachers for support, or if a teacher knows that a student is struggling, for example, in their Algebra 1 class, they can ask for those students to come see them during the intervention period to get support. And that's on top of the IXL intervention that we have as well at the high school. So, as the benchmark data comes along, we're definitely going to be, Algebra 1 is our highest target, because as you can see, throughout the years, that's been our lowest performance. And taking advantage of the PLCs, where teachers can have that conversation, talk about common assessments, and really dig deep in the data and look at students individually. and figure out a prescription for those students to make sure that they're getting the instruction, the intervention, and support that they need. We also have a homework club that we do at the high school that's starting up pretty soon. And then we're also introducing a tutoring program as well, as Mr. Metcalf mentioned, for our scholars in Algebra 1. And on top of that, I feel like I'm saying the same thing Mr. Metcalf did, because we're almost neck and neck in terms of the supports that we're providing for teachers and the interventions that we're providing for students, in that our teachers are getting professional development as well, on how to do the block scheduling, on how to work together and collaborate in PLCs to make sure that we meet the needs of our students.
So I'm going to go to the next slide, which shows again the high school by race. And that just gives an indication of the disaggregated data. And then Dr. Lahara, I'm going to actually go back so you can talk about literature and biology. Okay.
So for literature and biology, I mean, it's across the board, the interventions and strategies and professional development that we're providing our teachers. For literature, again, I feel like I'm saying the same thing that Mr. Metcalf says. We have new literature, textbooks, and novels for our literature literacy teachers, our ELA teachers, I'm sorry, so that students can have more autonomy and see themselves in the text that they read, to be more motivated to read. And again, that's the most important part, I feel, from K to 12, is that we need to make sure that our students leave the high school very fluent in literacy, and problem solvers, critical thinkers. And again, you know, PLCs is going to be very critical for us in English and biology, the professional development. And then again, we're going to track it with our benchmark data, which will be coming out soon, and we will be disaggregating and working with our teachers during PLC again on how to collaborate with Ms. Collins and Dr. Riley on how to collaborate and dig deep in the data, analyze the data, and then make informed decisions about instruction. You know, we also, you know, can't forget our special ed students are big population for us to make sure that they're on track, and making sure that our teachers are working with their caseloads and progress monitoring, and making sure that, you know, we meet the needs of all children. I know that there's a huge disparity between race, but there's, you know, we need to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all of our scholars. And again, you know, the high school is a heavier lift because of the amount of students that we have, close to 1,400. But I think that, you know, working together, structuring a plan that's built around professional development, you know, research-based interventions, and critical feedback to teachers, and visiting classrooms. And our big push right now in terms of classroom walkthroughs and instruction is engagement. It's just, how are you engaging students in your classroom? We know that this is a high school, and sometimes high school teachers feel that, you know, that they have the mindset that they're just content teachers. And, you know, they teach their contents, and, you know, students have to get it as they go. But, you know, we're trying to make sure that they're really engaging students in a meaningful way, you know, with small group instruction, with discussions, making them critically think, and be critical problem solvers, and be independent in how they conduct their schoolwork and complete their schoolwork, not just for a grade, but you know, to make sure that we accelerate learning, and that students actually come out learning when they leave the high school.
Thank you, Dr. Lahara. And you mentioned special ed, which we'll be turning to next, but I just want to take a moment to thank Dr. Collins, who recently ordered a huge variety of multicultural texts for the high school, nearly $16,000 of reading materials covering various racial and ethnic groups, wonderful pieces of literature. I actually saw the order for it. And We also know that when students see themselves in what they are reading, they develop more interest, they stay more engaged and connected with the text, and they develop a greater appreciation for literature in general when they see themselves represented. We know this is also true in terms of who's standing in front of them teaching them, that when they see other individuals who look like or sound like they do, they can relate better. So hopefully over time, as we continue to place a greater emphasis on multicultural literature, that truly is more representative of our student body in Cheltenham School District, we hope to see literature scores and ELA scores across the board continue to increase, because students see themselves and can relate to the characters that they're learning about in the text that they have. So I just wanted to thank Dr. Collins for her efforts in that area and for coming through with ordering those texts. So I just want to very quickly turn to special education. And as you can see, first of all, what's really important here, and I've collapsed the grades together to make it a little bit easier. At the top of this particular slide, there are 3 years, 2015-16, 16-17, 17-18, and then 18-19 and 2020-21 are on the bottom. So I just want to explain how the slide looks, first of all, over time. And the 18-19 year obviously kind of stands out in terms of the last year before the pandemic and before schools closed, in terms of performance seeming to kick up a little bit as far as English language arts for special ed students. Keep in mind, it's a smaller population of students who are taking the test in special education. So it is a subset of students as well. And in the very last year, the 2020-2021, the population size was approximately 20 students per grade, which is a very, very limited and small number. So I just want to, kind of advise everyone that when you look at these percentages, you're only talking, for example, 29% of 20 students is 6 children. So just want to keep that in mind as we look at these numbers for English language arts. And then in math, it's one graph going across all the grades 3 through 8. This is all of those 5 years. So this is a 5-year look back and gives a pretty good indication up until the last year, which was coming out of the pandemic last year, of where we're seeing some increases. So I'm happy to report that in just about every grade level, we're starting to see some increases in terms of student performance. Grade 3 is a little bit of an anomaly with that large number, 47% in 17-18, dropping down to nearly half in 18-19. But if you look at grade 4 and grade 5, although there's again another drop, grade 6, grade 7, and grade 8, the trend is moving up a little bit. So in some of those grades in particular, you're seeing some strides being made in terms of each cohort. Now, again, I just want to remind you, these are different cohorts of students. So we're not tracking one class over several different grades. These are different cohorts of children. And then in the Keystone exams, you can kind of get an indication of how our students are performing in those exams. And again, the numbers are fairly low. So for example, over here at the middle school, 100% of the children in middle school achieved proficiency. And that was one student in 2020, 2021. So these are small numbers except for algebra at the high school and literature and biology. where the average differs, but in the first 2 years, it was approximately 60 children. So in 15, 16, 16, 17, it was about somewhere between 60 and 70 special education students on average who took those exams. And then in the last 2 years before the pandemic, it averaged around 140 children in special education who took those exams. So the numbers are vastly different as time went on in terms of the numbers of students who sat for those exams. And again, we have to consider that with special education, we may have children who are either not taking the assessment, opting out of the assessment, or taking an alternate assessment. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to the principals one last time to see if anyone would like to make any additional comments about any of the data, and then we can turn it back to our chairs, Ms. Lohman and Mr. Pender, and the rest of the board in case anyone has any questions that you would like to ask anyone who's here this evening. So any of the principals have anything further to add? I'll ask you first.
So principals, at any time, we're going to move into questions from the board. And so if there are questions that you want to give some context to, give some insight and input to, please feel free to join in. So with that, now I'll turn it over to the board members to ask questions, and we'll go in order by raised hands as we do at other meetings. So Dan, Mr. Schultz, I see your hand up.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for this presentation. I really appreciate getting to hear from the buildings because obviously that's where the student interaction is occurring. That's where the policies are being actually executed in ways that can have an impact and move the needle. So this has been great to get to listen to. I'm very curious about the interventions that were mentioned. They sound effective. They sound like they will be effective. What I'm really curious about is the idea of individual students sort of being worked with based on their individual needs was mentioned a couple times. How are we checking in to see whether those interventions being put in place are working? Do we need to wait for the Keystones each year, or are we able to sort of get a sense of if the students are being reached and being brought up to speed before the next test? And that's kind of anyone who wants to answer that or can. I don't need to hear from every. I imagine it's a.
So I'll start, Dan. Normally,
Thank you.
like with our interventions, they're adaptive. So whatever the students, however the students score, it'll either bring them up or keep them at the same level. So we can always go in and do a diagnostic and print a diagnostic of every student and see where they are. You know, how much time they're logging in. You know, if they're even using the intervention, and then seeing the actual the alignment, the actual standards or substandards that they're working on. And pull a report to see if those students are really doing well in those with those. And teachers can also pull those reports as well to say, oh, okay, maybe I need to hit, I'm just gonna say numbers and operations a little bit more, because I saw that Dan was on IXL doing this, but he's still not scoring where he needs to. So let me pull him to do more small group instruction for that. So that's normally how interventions work and how you can really look at the effectiveness of it.
Thank you. And that makes sense. I guess I'm trying to think through a situation where there's a student who isn't engaging maybe with IXL or the intervention, and how can that student be reached? And that, I guess I'll pivot to my second question, which is around the teachers. And another reason I really appreciate getting this presentation from the building principals is is I know you see yourselves in the data. You own this data, and you own these outcomes. And how are the teachers brought into the fold to own their outcomes? Because it strikes me that they're the ones who need to not, I'm trying to choose my words carefully, but a student will be reached by a teacher. And so how can those teachers understand how important it is to know which of their students are struggling at this area and follow up with them?
Yeah, so at Elkins Park, we meet with the teachers. I'm sure my colleagues do the same thing. We meet with the teachers weekly, team meetings or grade meetings. During that time, we also look at this data, but not only that, we look closely at the student work and if the interventions are working. So during those grade team meetings and times working one-on-one with them, we review their class data as a whole. But then the other thing is when we go in to observe the classrooms, we're not only just looking at the instruction that's taking place, but we're closely observing whether or not the students are engaged and is the learning taking place and the progress that they're making towards the goals for them and an overall school community.
Thank you. And then my last question is there anything that you think needs to happen in your building that isn't already happening? And what support do you need in order to make that happen? And feel free to circle back to that. I know that's but like, how can I as a board member, how can we as a board help you accomplish what you want to accomplish?
I think the one thing, we all are looking for is more time, right? And that's something, we lost time, and that's hard for us to get back. So, this is a process, and I just want everybody to understand it's going to take some time for us to get back to where we are. We're still in a pandemic. We're still dealing with some cases of scholars being out and having to, and us trying to find another means for them to, be educated appropriately, missing, just having COVID, can put you out for max like 20 days if possible. So that time is something that's really important, and it's going to take a while for us to get back to where we are. I mean, I say it and it might not sound realistic, but just that year and a half could have a 5-year, detriment to us, easily. And so just, I'm just asking, be patient. We are going to move our schools collectively, and we'll continue to work really, really hard. But, that time is something that, while we want our scores to increase now and right away and get back to where they were, the year and a half had a detrimental impact on all of us. And, so at some point studies will show, hey, it took 4 to 5 to 6 years for kids to get back on track. Like that's going to come out at some point. We're not going to get it all back at once, but we're going to continue to try to get as much back as possible. And so, I think we all are working with Fidelity to ensure working with our teachers. Our teachers are also working with Fidelity. As Principal Wallace said, we're in our PLC meetings, we're in our team meetings, and we're having these collaborative conversations. And, I can definitely say everybody, one, is happy to be back in the building, at this stage, as well as our children, working really hard. So.
Excuse me, Mr. Schultz. Since I am a teacher, I would like to give my input on your question about teachers.
Yes, thank you.
Feel free to, yes, go ahead, Ms. Floyd.
Thank you. I wanted to speak upon the foundations and scholastic next steps. So foundations in the program, there are benchmarks and check marks that are given every few weeks. And I was in a classroom today as I was transitioning with my math students. And what happens is the teacher will give a foundations assessment. The teacher will recite a sentence, a teacher will ask students to tap out the words, and then the children will write their answers. And what the teacher does is the teacher looks at the assessment and says, okay, this is what I taught my students the last 4 to 6 weeks. Let me see if they were successful. If the students are successful, they're able to move to the next step. If students have an area of opportunity, that is when a teacher hones in on the data and says, this is what needs to be done to move my child forward. A few years ago, the district bought the Scholastic Book Room, which are beautiful guided reading books that teachers can use in small guided reading class and small guided reading groups. Also, there are the next steps assessment. And the next step assessments are a time when teachers meet one-on-one. So there we have that personal attention going on. One-on-one with your student, you're asked your student to read a book that is on their level. And then you will ask the child, you will take a record of the words that the children is reading correctly, the child is reading correctly or not. You will document that. You will ask the child comprehension questions. The teacher will be able to calculate all of that information to find out what reading level their scholar is on. And the teacher will be able to hone in on that, all of the strategies the scholar needs to learn. Excuse me for this broad explanation. And this is done at least 3 times a year. Now, if you feel as if your scholar is moving forward, then you can give the next steps assessment more times during the year. And so there is one-on-one time, you're able to have small group instruction. And of course, educators are able to monitor and move their scholars where they see fit. So that would be an example of assessments that teachers can use that information right away to guide their scholars.
Thank you.
Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen, you're still on mute.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't find the unmute button for some reason. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for the presentation. A few questions and comments. I'm not certainly encouraging teaching to the test or anything of that sort, but as with many other things during COVID, I assume that our students lost skills and training and just opportunities to take standardized tests and so on. And I guess my question is, are we looking at ways to reteach or to re-engage students in test taking, both in terms of as a skill and also being in the right mindset and emotional well-being around test taking, because it is something that they have to do with students, not just for purposes of these exams, but in general as well. So that would be my first question. If we're spending time and resources trying to re-engage our students in a positive way about taking exams, especially standardized exams.
If I can touch on that a little bit. For the K-4 level, last year was the first year that our students took the PSSA through the computer. In the past, it was always paper or pencil. So I did see that as although we didn't have a significant amount of students taking the test, I saw that as a big ask and a big challenge for our students. But that is something that, knowing that moving forward, we will be doing that. Those are strategies that we're putting into place early, where we're doing all of our assessments in first and second, that in the past used to be paper and pencil, we're doing it online. So a lot of what we used to do in the past, we're making adjustment and changes. We now have to teach our students strategies on how to take tests on the computer, obviously using scratch paper, using different strategies, because we know when students, especially our younger scholars, are on the computer, they sometimes just want to click, get things done and over with. But again, it does take a little bit of time. It does take some practice. It does really, especially for us at the elementary level, who in the past we used to print out all the tests. We used to have them do paper pencil. So that is a huge difference for our students moving forward. But hopefully in time, as they get used to taking these assessments and benchmarks throughout the year, they'll be accustomed to it and they'll build some of those strategies.
Great, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
The next is I guess a suggestion that can be taken for what it's worth would be that a number of times these presentations live outside of these meetings and they're on the web, which they should be, and they can be downloaded or viewed by people over a period of time. And part of the context is lost. I think part of the context that's missing on the actual slides themselves that was spoken about tonight was that obviously it was during the height of COVID and it was a very disruptive year. And also that the number of students taking the exams dropped dramatically. So I'm just suggesting that there be not a long footnote or explanation, but just a note to that effect, just to incorporate that so that when people are looking at this outside the context of tonight's presentation, they do have that context to help explain the numbers, at least in part, and the rationale possibly as to why they differed and mostly dropped off during last year. Thank you. That's all.
Mr. Burdell Williams.
Thank you, Ms. Henry. Yeah, I too appreciate the deep dive into the data. I know that you know, a lot of it, you know, it takes a lot of time to process the data. It takes a lot of time to like really understand the source of some of the challenges that we've been having, and I'm grateful for everyone's effort in really driving change, you know, as best we can. I know we won't see that change, you know, tomorrow, but I know that, you know, it's really comforting to know that we're looking at this, we're disaggregating our data, and we're really looking for ways to improve ourselves. So I just have two questions. One, you know, thinking about, you know, the way in which we spend our ESSER funds, I really wanted to just understand if any of the building principals, or even, you know, Dr. Hacker, anyone here on the line, you know, have we identified, like, I know we've talked about, you know, a few different means, so excuse me if I may be, you know, forgetting, you know, the handful of examples that we've seen so far, but, you know, identify some ways that we can, you know, utilize some of our ESSER funds to, you know, really help, you know, maybe our test performance, or maybe our ability to prepare for the test, or administer the tests in a way that our students feel more supported going in. You know, is there something that we've heard from them even as a recommendation? You know, I wish I had, you know, a room that played, you know, sounds from the beach or something while I was taking a test. I don't know. I'm just thinking of, you know, really creative ways for us to be able to utilize those funds, and wanted to know if we had, you know, taken any time, you know, and if we can just share a specific example or two from the schools and ways we're looking to spend those ESSER funds to help not just learning loss, but, you know, as it pertains to our performance, you know, looking at our testing.
I think probably everybody can mention at least one thing. So just shout them out, folks, everybody who's participating tonight or sitting in on the call, including our administrators in the cabinet. Everybody can cite at least one example of how those funds are being used to support academic achievement and improvement. So just shout them out, guys.
Tutoring.
Calculators.
Extra resources.
Reading
Intervention
material,
support.
interventions, books, reading books.
Awesome.
Anybody else? There's tons more. Lots of professional development. There's some professional guidance from both Arcadia and Penn for some of our historically underperforming students at the high school to help them with college essay writing, as well as with applying to colleges, and funding for dual enrollment for students who socioeconomically might not be able to afford to pay the cost to dual enroll in a high school / college course. So that's another example that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. The college essay writing idea actually came from our Cheltenham African American Alliance, who I had reached out to. There's some funding for summer school and after school tutoring and enrichment programming that's included, the multicultural resources that I mentioned before. So those are some of the examples, and you heard a bunch of other ones.
Yep. Thank you. And I know there are lots of examples, right? There's a lot of funds. So I'm sure there's a lot of wish lists
There
So I
actually,
think
and
it'll be good.
excuse me, I just thought of something else that somebody put in there, and I don't remember exactly what it refers to, but it piggybacks off of Mr. Perez's comment about taking the test online, which is a change. There are some digital math and I believe English language arts resources as well to help students become accustomed with doing that.
Awesome. And my last question is one that I know I plan to research a little bit more myself. But I wanted to understand if our students understand our data, our test data. Right? For myself, I'm constantly self-reflective about the individual who I am, and I can be the best version of myself. I'm just curious, how we solicit any feedback from the students about testing, whether the experience or outcomes, but effort is the most important for me. But I think there's like a lot to be said about how a student feels about themselves, and how this data might reflect the way a student feels about themselves. I know right now it is grouped in a really large grouped in really large cohorts, but just wanted to know if there was any feedback from the group as well on what they're hearing from students in regards to tests.
So one thing I will say is one of the scariest things that you will notice as a principal is if you walk around and look at students and you see in their face that they're struggling or they're not getting a concept or they don't understand. One of the things that was impressive about when they're now that they're back in school, even the students that came, the few that came that took the test last year, as they were talking about, they understood what they were able to do and what they needed extra help in. And so one of the things that I noticed is 5th and 6th grade might be the age where they start to become really concerned with how they're doing. They are a little bit more conscious of their future. They're starting to think about their plans, what they like, what they don't like. And one thing that I can say about the Elkins Park students is they really care about doing the best that they can, and they care about it as a whole community. So it's not just like, I'm going to do well, you might not do that well. What are we going to do as a class? How can we succeed as a 5th grade? And so they're real excited when they get their benchmarked results if one class beats out the other. And you have to be careful with that as well. But they are buying into the data, and they're all happy about progress, and they really cheer each other on and really encourage each other's success.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Wallace, because I guess that's where I was getting at, right? Like, and one thing I've seen in Cheltenham, I've lived here for almost 9 years, been a part of the Little League Baseball organization, and I've spent time in every one school. So that, right, is the strong sense of community and support from like the students around us. And like, I don't know when that starts. I don't know if it starts in kindergarten or 3rd grade or 5th grade or 8th grade, but I see it all the time. And I that was really the source of my question. Like, how are the students, socializing or normalizing testing, or the challenges behind, being scholarly and wanting to do, their very best and support one another. So thank you for sharing that, Mr. Wallace.
And we see it too. I see it starting usually around 5th and 6th grade. And what we try to tell them is just do the very best that you can. And as Mr. Metcalf said, one of the things that we do is we try to encourage that in morning announcements and talking to the students over and over again, and to have that whole approach that do the very best you can, but we all do this together. And you start to see a little bit of that in 5th and 6th grade. So I do understand that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Anybody else? I'm good. That was all I had. Just a few questions for the group there.
Thank you, Mr. Burdell Williams. Ms. Lohman?
Thank you, Ms. Henry. First of all, thank you everyone thank you, Dr. Hacker, and to all the principals and administrators for this presentation. As one board member who's still relatively new to the board, I really appreciate this information. I actually had been looking for it when I came on the board last year. I can only find bits and pieces of it on our website, so I really appreciate having it all in one place now. That being said, I also know that PSSAs and Keystones are not the end all and be all of, how we measure student success, but unfortunately they're the state tests that we have to deal with. And so um, I have just a couple of questions. First of all, just a couple of questions about acronyms. If maybe someone could tell us, I think I can guess what some of them mean, but MTA, multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, PLC, professional learning communities, PD obviously is professional development, C&I is curriculum and instruction. I'm just sort of going through this in the off chance that somebody goes back and watches this presentation and is like, huh, I wonder what all of wonder what those acronyms mean. And I guess my question partly is also sort of what is the importance of all of those things to improving student outcomes? Again, I think I can guess, but I'm sort of curious as to kind of where MTSS plays in. Obviously, professional development, but like professional learning communities, and sort of why are those important pieces to have in place?
So I'll speak on the professional learning communities, especially at the high school. Ms. Loman, because in the past, we didn't have that that common planning time for our teachers. They couldn't meet as a department to go over common assessments or student data like they can now. So now, once every 6 days, those departments can meet. And for example, now that we have the benchmark data coming out, now we can have a discussion with all of those teachers. For example, for Algebra 1, we can have that learning time to go over the data, to go over it, disaggregate it, look at what students are the ones that are doing well, what students are not doing well. And then as a team, what is it that you need from us as administrators to support you, to make sure that you have the resources and the strategies and to tie in professional development and the training that you would need to make sure you are meeting the needs of those students that really need that support, but also keeping the students that are proficient or advanced, to keep them at that level as well, so that you don't focus so much on the ones that are on the bubble or below that you forget about the ones that are proficient or advanced, and then all of a sudden you have everyone clumped in the middle. You want to keep those guys where they are in the top, but then also bring the floor up as well.
I'll just add to that, and I think that was a great explanation that Dr. Lahara gave. But teaching is a very isolating profession. You go in your room, you close the door, and you're by yourself in there for however many periods a day, whether it's a block period or an 8-period day. And then you go home and you prepare your lessons and you come back and you do the same thing. What the PLC offers is an opportunity that teachers rarely have to actually share and discuss ideas, strategies, teaching methodologies, information about the students that they're working with, and collaborate on how to do better. It gives them an opportunity to talk about resources that they've each used and found that have been successful. It gives them an opportunity to plan together so there's consistency. For example, if you have 4 teachers teaching US History 1, they work together, as Dr. Lahara said, on common assessments to ensure students are being expected to master the exact same things in each of those courses. But I think most importantly, it gives teachers a sense of community within their department or their grade level, and it gives them the opportunity to share with one another what is working in their classrooms or to support one another when they need assistance.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to all those things. I would say leadership, right? If we can't develop teacher leadership within our schools, then you have the same people doing all the work. And so it's going to be very difficult to, enable for our schools to grow collectively. And so, looking at the PLCs, the team meetings, CIPD, right? We're spreading teachers out and putting them in different leadership roles where they're able to, feel like, they have a say in what's happening in our school. They're able to, develop each other, through peer coaching. They're able to see different strategies that other teachers may be doing as they're looking at student data, and I think those are some of the things that, that might be invisible, when you walk into a school, you might not necessarily see unless you're actually going into like the PLC meeting, unless you're actually at, the CIPD meeting, unless you're actually in a team meeting to see how we're talking about children, unless you're in MTSS meeting to see, again, how we're identifying those areas of weakness, and then who's bringing the information, right? That leadership piece, I think, is just so strong and so important, because when you don't have those opportunities, you have like the same 10% of the teachers doing majority of the work, right? And so trying to build and cultivate that leadership so everybody takes ownership, right? The teachers are also part of the stakeholder group. And I think that's just important. And that's what it really does. It creates a culture where, you're having teachers become more involved in the practices and things that are happening. And I think that's our ultimate goal. How do we keep them and get them to be more involved in what's going on as the key stakeholders?
Would someone like to address MTSS and how that multi-tiered system of supports operates and intensifies as you go through each tier?
Absolutely. So one of the things is, and I'll put Ms. Keene helped us to work with the system, and one of our teachers actually came up with a new system, and we actually borrowed it from Cedarbrook. So it's already in place in Cedarbrook. And what we do is every 2 weeks, the principal, the assistant principal, 2 counselors meet. They review students who have been referred to the process. And they can be referred to a process at any time. We use the same Google form that is used at Cedarbrook, which is an outstanding form, which sort of lets a teacher recommend a student that they may be concerned about for a few reasons. Maybe it's emotional or social or behavioral, but also academic, or perhaps we just want to make sure we check in on the student. Once we do that, then we have a team maybe go observe the student or look at the student or follow up with the student or contact the parents. And then this is the most important part. We add some interventions or things that we put in place to help the student along the way. And what we find is sometimes we need to add more interventions or get the student some more help. But a lot of times those interventions that we start out in the first process, which you could call tier 1, help the student to turn around. We're able to find some things that are missing. And then overall, the student is able to recover and do well. That's going to be very important when we have students that are back in the building for the first time, meaning back in the building brick and mortar, and very important to make sure that we continue to progress monitor the success of the student. So that's an example of how we use MTSS to ensure all of our students are doing well, but also to identify those students that might need a little extra help so that we can provide it before it gets too deep into the school year.
Thank you. Those were really very helpful answers, and I appreciate that. MTSS reminds me a little bit of the old instructional support team process. If that, yeah, okay.
As Brian was talking, that's exactly what I was thinking. It is absolutely modeled after the old IST process.
Okay, good. Then I have a picture of what that looks like. Then and the question I guess I have sort of that piggybacks on that is, are all of our schools using PLCs and MTSS, or is that just in the upper level schools right now, or is in some, I'm just curious how that's all playing out.
PLCs were implemented at the middle school and the high school, but our elementary schools all have grade level team meetings in lieu of a formal PLC, but it's the same idea. It's the opportunity for teachers to come together to collaborate. So it's grade level in the other grades and PLCs in the middle school and the high school with the block schedule in mind. They're on a 6-day cycle. So one of those 6 days is devoted to a PLC for a certain group of teachers.
And speaking on behalf of the K to 4, we are also MTSS schools as well. So we have a process in place very similar.
Thank you. I'm going to try not to monopolize. I love this kind of stuff, and I'd be happy to like sit here and talk to you all night about this, but I'm not going to do that. But I do have a few more questions. One of the questions I also sort of had, and this is a sort of a larger question, and I think Dr. Riley and Mr. Pimental are on this call as well, but this is more to do with sort of how do we get sort of, I mean, we have to do this, is there state requirements, we have to, administer these tests, but how do we get to sort of what we want our students to know and be able to do through more authentic types of assessments, like portfolio assessments and other ways of assessing students who might not do so well under standardized test conditions?
Jenny, were you directing that to Dr. Riley?
Or anybody, yeah, if Dr. Riley, I was thinking about them in particular because I think that project-based learning probably is engaging in some more of those type of authentic assessments. And I'm just sort of wondering if, as part of the PBL programming, there's been some, what consideration has been given to sort of how do we assess what those students in particular, what we want them to know and be able to do that, might not be able to be captured on a standardized test.
And so I'll jump in a little bit because that's exactly what I thought as you asked that question was, my mind goes right to project-based learning because that's centered around authentic experiences and therefore authentic assessments as well. But that's not the only place. One thing that we have been talking about off and on with PBL is the idea of implementing a digital portfolio. It's something that I also introduced to a group of teachers last year as a potential pilot for them to start collecting student work in a way that we're asking students to think about their own performance outside of a traditional assessment. And so that they can examine the work that they're doing based on the teacher's assignments, decide what they want to share through their digital portfolio, and then also offer a reflection on that work. And so that's one way that we can engage with students at all levels, whether they're in project-based learning or not, to think about the things that they're learning in terms of the knowledge and what they're able to do in a more authentic way. And so the digital portfolio is a piece for, again, all grade levels, specifically for project-based learning. And so on the flip side of that, also trying to think about ways that we can change the learning model for the elementary students so that they're also engaging in more project work and not necessarily less, but different ways to practice skills. And so that it's part of a larger project that's not a standalone procedure, thinking more specifically about mathematics, where there is two strands essentially of learning. One is more about the procedural piece of math versus the conceptual piece. And so there are different things that are built into the Envision platform this year, the new version of Envision called 3-Act Math, that asks students to participate in that learning in that way, so that there is that procedural piece and the conceptual piece that provides students the opportunity to really demonstrate their learning in a more unique way than what we've seen in the past. And that learning is an easy way to present that to an audience is through that digital portfolio.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. That's the kind of thing I've been really thinking about, is sort of how do we get to the skills that we're teaching students in other ways that we want to be able to measure those higher order thinking skills. And I think that's fascinating, and I'd love to hear about that kind of thing. And because I also think, we all know, like, some of the students who might be scoring basic or below basic on the PSSAs or on the Keystones are students who also probably, obviously the older ones, hold jobs, get to their jobs independently. They have all kinds of life skills that are not being reflected perhaps on what they're in their standardized test scores. that we have students who may be scoring high on standardized test scores, but might not have those life skills. Like they might not be able to navigate SEPTA if you stuck them on a train and told them to get into Center City. So I think, that those are the kinds of things that I've love for the district to sort of grapple with in terms of how we really make assessments authentic to test, other skills that we want kids to be able to have. So I think my only other question is about the final group of slides, which is the scores for our special education students. And kind of, we've talked about some of the interventions for regular education students, and kind of what are we thinking of in terms of intervention for special education students who might be struggling? I know it's all very individualized, but maybe building on some of the regular ed interventions, kind of what are we looking at to put in place for some of the special ed interventions?
So I would just say one of the good things about IXL, it's an intervention for anybody, no matter what level you're on, right? Because it's going to, especially if you do the diagnostic, it actually will create a program for you specifically, right? So that's one way of getting like that individualism, or individual support, that program being created. I think at the high school level and middle school level, and Rennie, sorry for speaking, in this, I'm just speaking from the experience, because we also have academic achievement support classes, in which we can target, the learning deficits of children based on the goals that they may have for their IEP. So that's also something, and I think being more intentional in that class, I think is a real focus for us this year. We are going to be observing, our WIN classes. We are going to be observing the academic achievement support classes. We are going to be providing feedback to ensure that teachers are, if they were, if it was perceived as a study hall one year, it's not happening like that this year, And so just trying to make sure we're intentional, because, it's easy to be in a class where maybe if someone's not coming in, and maybe you've gotten into a practice of, kind of just helping the kids with homework, right? That's not what we want. That's not what those classes are for, and so how are we intentional about ensuring that we're getting what we need and want out of those classes for our scholars? And so again, like with anything, we have to continue to provide feedback for our staff members. We have to continue to coach, and present different and new ideas and ways of how to do things so we can collectively just work better, with our time.
And I would also add that we have quite a few interventions for the students in all the grade levels. With reading, we have Read Naturally, we have Systems 44, we have Read 180. We have recently implemented Reading Mastery. We have in our life skills classes, we've worked closely with the IU to align the curriculum with the alternate standards. And we have Readtopia and Unique Learning Systems is new for us this year, that we partnered with the state in a grant with them. And we have just recently finished the case reviews at Elkins Park. And when we talked with some of the teachers, some of the things that we determined were some of the students needed to go back into general education for the main lessons and go to their WIN period to get their support, sort of like at the middle school and high school, where they use the academic achievements. And then there were other students who we felt needed more support. And we were looking for different opportunities for them with the reading specialists and the math specialists alongside of the them going into special education. So we have done that at EP, and we're hoping to be able to do that at all the other schools in the upcoming month.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to stop.
Okay. So Ms. Hayward had to leave the meeting, but she did leave a question that I want to ask, which is, she says, one of my questions is, does each school have a written plan to address this performance, and what KPIs will be tracked and reported out to the board and the community?
Repeat the question again, Pam? I wasn't.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, so her question was around the student data, and even in some of the discussion that was going on about things that are happening. What she wanted to know is, will each school have a written plan to address the performance and what KPIs, key performance indicators, will be tracked and reported out to the board and community.
I didn't know if one of the principals was going to answer that or if Dr. Smith was going to jump in and respond to that.
I can jump in.
Okay. Thank you.
In the past, we've given our principals data protocols. And with those data protocols, and teachers also had data protocols as well. And after each formal assessment, whether it be a summative assessment or a formative assessment, teachers, and this can also take place at the PLCs that were discussed earlier. And so teachers complete those data protocols. They outline how their students did. They also break it out by race, by different subgroups, such as special education, gifted education, low SES, so on and so forth. And that information is then discussed and shared at their PLC meetings. And the principals in the past have submitted those data protocols to either my office and or the superintendent's office to show that they have reviewed the data and to show a written plan of what they're going to do as a result of the data. So that we could absolutely go back to that model, and that would satisfy Ms. Haywood's question. In terms of the key performance indicators, they are around the math standards, around the ELA standards, and as appropriate, the science standards based on the tested grades for science. And with those data protocols, the principals will come back to my office and say, based on our data, here are the areas we need to work with students on. This is how we're going to reassess those students. And this is how we're going to measure success. So that has been a process that we've used in the past in order to review data, in order to address data, and also to have a written plan to explain exactly how we're going to do the things that we say we need to do. And it's all based on data.
So if I could follow up a bit more on that question, because if that's done if that's been what's been done in the past, and we're still seeing the data trend down. Now, we all agree that 2019-20, the pandemic, children all across the world, were impacted by that learning, but our data was trending down before then. And so the question, wait, let me finish my whole thought. So my question and following up on that is, so you're saying that there are written plans and we're talking about the data, but how are we measuring progress along the way? And if that progress isn't being realized, what's being done to redirect it? Because it's not just about having the plans, it's how are we looking at and measuring progress?
So that's out of my wheelhouse because the superintendent supervises the principals. So, and because we're in between and transition, I can't speak to exactly how Dr. Marseille worked with our principals to improve that data, but that is typically how it was done in the past, that once those plans were done, once my office reviewed the plans and made sure that the goals were measurable, they were SMART goals, they were actionable, then they met with the superintendent to talk about how those plans and how their progress either supported principals and school goals or not. And the second thing is about trending downward with the data. You're absolutely right. We have been trending down with the data, but that hasn't been exclusively because of student achievement. A lot of that has to do with the district has not had written curriculum and had not had written curriculum for over 10 years prior to me coming in 2016. The last updated curriculum and the curriculum audit didn't want to go past 10 years, but it was at least 10 years. There was no written format, no written blueprint for our teachers to prepare our children. And secondly, because we didn't have any written curriculum, our district was not following the state standards. And all of the assessments and the data that you've seen tonight is based on state standards. So if we're not teaching based on the standards, then our children don't have what they need to perform on the tests. So those tests may not show whether or not our children have mastered state standards because they were not exclusively and explicitly taught. And so that was what the whole curriculum audit was about. And we're in a good space now, and the pandemic kind of threw us off our game. We were really excited to see what the data would look like after having written curriculum. And also, as you know, that data was trending downward because we didn't have common planning time. Prior to 2016, the elementary schools didn't have common planning time, the middle school didn't have it, and the high school didn't have it. So again, I think Dr. Hacker mentioned this in her earlier comments, is that when you have our teachers working in isolation, doing the best that they can do, and it's not based on standards, we're not getting the results that show whether or not our kids have mastered that. And so it's a compilation of things. I could tell you the special education data is trending downward because when I first arrived to the Cheltenham School District, and Ms. Collins and Dr. Riley came shortly thereafter, we realized that a lot of our special education students hadn't even been being tested. So it looked like it went down when in fact we actually started testing children. And I can't speak to why we didn't test children before or how children were removed from the testing window, but there were multiple, I guess you can call it like a perfect storm. There were multiple things at play that led to that data. And we've always said in multiple meetings that that data really doesn't reflect what happens when our children are exposed to standards aligned and standards based curriculum. We have just gotten to that point, and we had just gotten to that point prior to the pandemic, and we were hoping for some good 2020 scores because, as Dr. Riley mentioned, Envision had upgraded and updated since the last time we met. And those of you who have been on the board for some years now, or at least 4 to 5 years, we also updated the math course sequence, where we made sure that all students had really good, really quality standards-based math instruction and math exposure, and that wasn't happening as well. So I would say that when you don't have when you don't have any written curriculum, first of all, and then when we're trying to get our teachers to be accustomed to the standards-based curriculum and to give them professional development and to give the systems time to stick, that's why we've been having some of these results, because we haven't had what we've needed to be successful for quite some time.
So Dr. Smith, one of the questions that I have, and this may not be a question for this meeting, maybe this is something that we will come back and explore in November, is if we know we were doing things a certain way pre-pandemic, and that wasn't working, what are we doing to change that, and what plans are being made? That's my question going forward. And just let me finish.
Oh, I thought you were done.
How are we, what KPIs are we going to be putting in place? Assessment data, what those written plans are, and how progress is going to be measured for students along the way.
So the KPIs are the data that we get from our summative assessments, which are the Keystones and the PSSAs, as well as our formative assessment, which are our benchmark exams that we give 3 times a year. And I think Ms. Floyd also brought in some of the other exams and assessments that students take along the way through our elementary programs, through foundations, through wonders, through teacher-made tests. So we're always assessing students, and those key performance indicators are growth. Have they grown in mathematics? Have they grown in ELA standards? Have they grown in science areas? So those are the key performance indicators. And it's not that we continue to do the same thing. What I'm saying is, right before the pandemic hit, we all felt like, as an Office of Education, We've had a couple years of a curriculum that was standards-based. We had a writing curriculum in place. We didn't have any of those things. And so right before the 2020 testing period, we felt strongly we have what we need in place. We should see the results that reflect that. We did not take the 2020 exam as has been mentioned on this call. And the 2021 exam is not reliable because we had so few students take it. And the manner in which they took it was not how we've done under other circumstances. So it was not, we have made some significant changes. We're not doing what we've always done. We've made some very clear changes with the schedule at the high school, with strengthening the PLCs at the middle school. We just haven't had an opportunity to see what that looks like on a summative assessment because of the 2020 testing and the 2021 testing. We're with the, the 19 testing and the 20 testing, you can't even compare the two. PDE put out a statement. If you check their website, basically, cautioning or advising school districts about sharing the last 2 years worth of data because it's not going to give us what we need.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. It doesn't still seem to answer the question that I have, but I appreciate the
Can you repeat your question? Because I don't want to leave without you getting your response. So maybe I'm not understanding.
So basically, my question was a follow-up to Ms. Hayward's question about having those written plans and how it's going to be tracked and reported to the board and the community, and not just a once a year timeframe for this. And let me follow up a little bit more with my question around that, because another thought that and kind of a visceral reaction that I had to hearing that we could be waiting another 4 or 5 years to see our students at achievement. And I think we can't wait. That, as a board member running for re-election and looking at our students, I don't think we have the option to wait 4 or 5 years. And I think that there are things that can be done. Now, I'm not an administrator, so I can't tell people how to do their jobs. That's not what my role is here. But there are 2 things that sit top of mind for me. That is, there's the ESSER funding. The board is, it's our job to make sure that our students and that our teachers have what they need to be successful in the classroom. So that takes me back to the question that was asked earlier around how does the board support this district and this administration around the decisions that we need to make when we're sitting around the table so that our students are getting what they need. That's the top question that I have around that.
So thank you. And so 2 things, I did not say that we needed 4 to 5 years. So I don't want to own that is what we're projecting. So that's not, I agree. Long story short. So I don't think it's going to take us 4 to 5 years to right the ship. So I wanted to be clear on that. In terms of what do we need to do, next month's presentation, one of several presentations. Next month, we're going to outline our after school and before school tutoring that we're going to put in place to make sure that we have targeted support for our children, not just based on, I'm coming to show up for tutoring, but to make sure that they are exposed to standards-based and standards-aligned instruction. We had a pre-meeting with CEA to talk about what this tutoring program would look like, and their leadership is on board. We're expecting it to be at least 4 students per teacher, no more than 8, maximum of 10. So we are giving some very guided and some very specific instruction. And what I will say is the best way for to show student achievement and to turn around student performance is to make sure that we are presenting standards-based and standards-aligned instruction, period. And the reason why we have those standards is because you're right. You can't wait till PSSA, you can't wait till Keystone to see results. But if we're teaching to those standards all year long, That is how kids get what they need in that particular grade to be successful and what the state has said that they need in order to move forward to the next grade. So that's what we're going to do. And we've been doing that. And I think that the disappointing thing is the last two exams, we have not been able to successfully show how well our students have been doing, because that is the kind of primary point. In terms of, how do we, make changes? How do we respond to the plans? That would be for our new superintendent as well as our acting superintendent to talk about how that would be kind of mapped out. So my office has been supporting those plans. My office has been making sure that all the schools have the intervention programs that they need to make sure that they have all the resources that they need. We've been polling our schools to make sure that any professional development where teachers feel like they need more support or they need more understanding to deliver services, we've been supporting that. But in terms of the accountability for the plans, that rests with the superintendent, and the accountability for the actual teaching rests with the principals.
And all of it rests with all of us, because, when our parents are asking us questions, they're looking to all of us for that guidance in that direction. So I hope that we're working towards a unified approach to this, and not saying what each office is responsible for, but making sure that we're doing whatever part that we have in this process to support our students in their learning and their success.
And I think every principal on here can speak to the support that my office provides for their children as well as their teachers. And for them.
Well, principals, they're the boots on the ground and that are making it happen. So that's
yes, and we are, and the Office of Education has put ourselves at their disposal whenever they need anything from us.
Yeah. All right, I'd like to go back out to the board and see if there were any other follow-up questions. Mr. Schultz.
Thank you. And Ms. Henry, thank you for putting a really good point on the table around time and the fact that we really do want to see. I mean, we just looked at trend data. I'm sure that 5 years ago we were also looking at trend data saying we need to improve these numbers, and it will take time. So I really am anxious to have a process where we can look more frequently, ideally in a way that is visible to the community between these large tests. And that's, I think, what Ms. Haywood's question was about, where we can get to a point where on a monthly basis, we can say, here was the written plan for improvement in a given building, not district-wide, because each building is going to have their own specific needs and their own specific challenges. So what were the identified challenges? Have the things that have been put into place been effective? What's worked and what hasn't? And how do we iterate quickly and start to actually see the improvements in terms of our tenures, right? Like I think that's one of the realities, is that 5 years, it's hard to have that be a pulse point. And meanwhile, we have obviously kids. Anyway, you all live this, breathe this, and I know that you all believe this too. So the question, just to underscore, or I guess can we get to a point where we know, not every October, but ideally every quarter, what is working, what isn't working, what do we as a board need to help you all focus on by providing resources or passing policies that, we passed an equity policy, I think, that hopefully is going to be able to manifest in some of the focus that had been previously identified. I just wanted to throw that charge out. Obviously, that is going to be a conversation with Dr. Scriven, and it would be on him to sort of decide how that manifests. But I think that's really what we're getting at here, is what are the plans on paper that are unique to each building, and how can we evaluate whether those plans are being effective, and how can we adapt as quickly as possible to plans that aren't working, and how can we double down on the ones that are? So thank you.
So
Okay. Oh, I'm
oh.
sorry, go ahead, Dr. Smith.
One of the things I want to add too is principals visiting classrooms and having a regular pulse on the teaching and instructional practices. We started that about 3 or 4 years ago, and I believe that has been very effective in terms of knowing where the gaps are, where the support is needed. I think our teachers have become more accustomed to having regular classroom visits. So I think that is those instructional rounds, and it's research-based. It can be, supported by research. I think that's one of the things that we've done recently and done really well in terms of supporting our teachers and also getting real-time feedback as to how students are doing.
Thank you.
All right, I'd like to go to the community. There was one question in chat. If you are in the community and you have a question, please raise your hand and we will unmute you.
Ms. Henry, I think there was a question in the Q&A from Mr. Epps.
Yes, and Mr. Epps raised he did raise his hand.
Oh, okay, he did.
If we could have him unmuted, I think Dr. Hacker, you or I can allow him to talk. So I'm just going to click on that button to see if he can talk. Mr. Epps, please state where you reside in the community. Let me see. There it is.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Zachary Epps. I live in Melrose Park. And I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible. I recognize some of you may have started 5:30, 6, 7 this morning, and we're this evening talking about data. But I so appreciate it. And I'd have to give a shout out to the strong instructional leader that we have at Myers Elementary, Principal Jason Lytle. He gave us a preview of tonight of the data at Myers yesterday. My question, Dr. Smith, and others, as you all talked about the data, you raised a really good point about there was no curriculum, right? And that needed to be updated. You talked about the impact of COVID, right? We always talk about the impact of COVID and on learning. And so some of that to me really screams like that's the story behind the data. And my question is really about qualitative data. And so one piece is how are schools, people within schools, how do you start to have some of those conversations about the story behind the data before decision making? And then a second part would be, are there any other types of qualitative data that is used in addition to test scores that really show where student performance is?
Thank you. Those are both good questions. So the conversations about the data and what it means and what it doesn't mean, what we can infer, what we can analyze from the data, all of those things are discussed at our PLC meetings, our professional learning community meetings. And we mentioned earlier in the call that they happen at all school levels from K through 12. Those conversations also happen during our informal walkthroughs. I just mentioned that a few moments ago. And what that looks like is our building leaders, our principals, they go to classrooms, they have a checklist, they're looking for certain things. They give teachers feedback on the good things that they've seen, the positive things that they've seen, and how it translates to supporting students. And they also share with our teachers areas of improvement. And what happens is when you see a trend of, there's a group of teachers or a group of staff members who aren't doing this one thing right, then that is, a time for our principals, our building leaders to stop and revisit something and say, hey, you know what? Guided reading, I'm noticing that out of 10 classrooms, in 7 of the classrooms, guided reading, for example, is not being implemented properly. So that is a time for the leaders to step back and figure out, how do I get the teacher support? How do I send this message out to make sure that we modify that practice. And that works in reverse too, when they see something positive and something going well. So to your question, when they have those meetings, when they have those sessions, they not only talk about the quantitative data, the numbers you've seen, but they also talk about the qualitative. To your point, the story behind this. How did we get here? What does this data say? What doesn't it say? And when you look just at the raw numbers and you see the decline, it doesn't speak to the fact that we haven't had a written curriculum. It doesn't speak to the fact that, I want to say up until 2 years ago, we had books in classrooms dated as far as 2004. Yeah. So all of those things play into, why we're not seeing what we should see on our summative assessments. And we have been working at a breakneck speed of trying to get everything in place so that we do have what we need in front of our students. And this is not just about to raise test scores, but to make sure that our children are receiving the instruction that they need, that they deserve, so that when they take these exams, they do show growth. They show that they retain information, and they show, that they are prepared to continue to move forward through the educational system. So all of our principals have qualitative conversations with their staff members, with their teachers, and this goes along with the data. So yes, the data does tell, the numbers are one thing, but most of these numbers do have stories behind them. And some of it does require some historical knowledge to know that some of these numbers are what they are because of things that are not, typical. For example, we had a curriculum audit that showed K-8, we had 0 written curriculum documents. Does that answer your question, Mr. Epps?
Oh, thanks. I wasn't sure if there was like a back and forth, but yes, that does answer
Sorry
my
about
question.
that.
Yeah, no. It does answer my question. And it sounds like those conversations are had before it's like, okay, what do we do about it? And so from a parent and community member's perspective, like hearing that story behind the curve is just as important, or if not more important, than seeing some of the numbers. So that we understand, okay, this is why it's happening, because it's addressing some of the root causes that's trending to the data.
Exactly.
Okay, are there any other community questions? I don't see any other hands raised. Okay. All right, well, with that, I will take an motion to adjourn this meeting. We made up on this meeting what we shortened the meeting.
I move to adjourn. I'll take that honor.
Can I get a
Need
second?
Second, Jennifer Lemon.
The meeting is adjourned. Good night, everyone.